The silver fork stopped halfway to Marcus Whitfield's mouth, the truffle risotto cooling on the tines as his eyes locked onto the small figure hovering near the restaurant's gilded entrance. The boy's clothes hung like rags on a scarecrow, his hollow cheeks catching the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers. This wasn't another street beggar looking for handouts. This was opportunity wrapped in desperation. A woman at table 12 gasped, her wine glass slipping from manicured fingers to shatter against Italian marble. The sharp crack echoed through Magnolia Restaurant's hushed elegance, drawing every patron's attention to the trembling child who had dared enter their sanctuary of privilege. Marcus remembered another boy once, standing just as small and frightened in a different doorway 30 years ago, watching his mother walk away forever. "Security," he called softly, his voice carrying the weight of old wounds and newer hungers. What Marcus Whitfield was about to unleash in the next 5 minutes would destroy 3 lives and save 2 souls, though he had no way of knowing which was which. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Tommy Harrison had learned that hunger makes different sounds depending on what time of day it strikes. Morning hunger whispered like autumn leaves, afternoon hunger growled like distant thunder, but midnight hunger screamed. The rusted trailer that Tommy shared with Sarah Mitchell sat at the forgotten edge of Charleston's Riverside Mobile Home Park, where Spanish moss draped over power lines like funeral shrouds and the sweet scent of magnolias couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of poverty. Sarah had been his guardian since he was 3, when his mother disappeared and his father became a name that was never spoken aloud. Now, at 72, Sarah moved through their cramped home like a woman walking through fog, her once sharp mind betraying her in moments that left Tommy more frightened than he dared admit. "Tommy, honey, did you remember to feed Beethoven?" Sarah would ask, referring to the piano that had been sold 2 years ago to pay for her medications. Tommy had learned to play along, nodding and humming a few bars of something he remembered from better days, watching the confusion clear from her cloudy blue eyes. Sarah had been a music teacher for 43 years at Charleston Elementary, back when the world made sense and children's voices filled classrooms with songs about friendship and hope. Her small teacher's pension barely covered the rent, and her growing collection of pill bottles leaving Tommy to bridge the gap between survival and starvation. He sold candy outside St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on Sundays, his clear soprano voice drawing tourists who dropped quarters into his coffee can while they pretended not to notice his threadbare clothes. The irony wasn't lost on him that he sang for strangers who had more money in their purses than he'd seen in his entire life. While just 10 miles away, Marcus Whitfield counted millions from the 34th floor of his downtown penthouse. Marcus had built his real estate empire on the bones of Charleston's historic district, buying up properties that families like Tommy's could never afford and transforming them into luxury developments with names like Heritage Oaks and Magnolia Dreams. What Tommy didn't know, what no one knew except the private investigator Marcus had hired, was that Eleanor Whitfield had been watching the boy for months. The elegant woman in her late 60s would park her silver Mercedes across from the church every Sunday, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white as she listened to Tommy's voice carry across the parking lot. She'd tried to approach him twice, but something always stopped her, perhaps the weight of secrets that had been buried for 3 decades, or the fear that some sins were too deep to ever be forgiven. Eleanor knew things about Tommy Harrison that would shatter the boy's understanding of his own identity. She knew why his eyes were the same startling green as Marcus's, why his voice carried the same haunting quality that had once filled concert halls across Europe, and why Sarah Mitchell looked at her with recognition tinged by decades-old betrayal whenever their paths crossed at the grocery store. The collision of these 3 lives was inevitable. It was also about to become devastating. The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Tommy made the decision that would change everything. Sarah had been sitting in her faded armchair for the past hour, staring at an empty corner of their trailer and humming a lullaby to someone who wasn't there. Her medication bottle sat unopened on the kitchen counter. They'd run out of money for refills 2 weeks ago, and Tommy had watched helplessly as the fog in her mind grew thicker each day. "Mama's coming home soon," Sarah whispered to the corner, using the voice she once reserved for frightened children on their first day of school. "She just went to get milk from the store." Tommy's stomach clenched with something deeper than hunger. His mother had been gone for 8 years, and Sarah knew it, or used to know it back when knowing things was something she could count on. Now her memories floated in and out like radio stations in a thunderstorm, sometimes crystal clear, sometimes nothing but static and wishful thinking. The $23 in their coffee can wasn't enough for groceries and medication. It wasn't enough for rent, which was already 12 days late. It wasn't enough for the electric bill that would shut off their power if not paid by Friday. Tommy had learned to do arithmetic in survival, and every equation came up the same: not enough, never enough, and running out of time. He'd tried everything he could think of, mowing lawns until his hands bled from the old push mower's rough handle, collecting aluminum cans from dumpsters behind the college dormitories, even singing outside the tourist restaurants where well-dressed couples emerged with their bellies full and their consciences just guilty enough to spare some change. But Charleston's charity had limits, and Tommy had exhausted most of them. The Magnolia restaurant sat in the heart of the historic district like a jewel in a crown, its brass nameplate polished to mirror brightness and its windows glowing with warm amber light that promised warmth and abundance. Tommy had walked past it dozens of times, watching through the tall windows as servers in crisp white shirts carried silver platters to tables where people laughed and gestured with wine glasses that probably cost more than his monthly food budget. He'd never considered going inside. Places like the Magnolia weren't built for people like him, and everyone involved understood that unspoken rule. But desperation has a way of rewriting the rules, and 3 days of watching Sarah talk to empty corners had stripped away Tommy's sense of where he belonged. The doorman looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone paid to keep problems on the sidewalk. Tommy's sneakers had holes that let in the rain, his jeans were held together with duct tape at the knees, and his jacket, a hand-me-down from the church donation box, hung loose on his thin frame like a scarecrow's costume. "Kitchen entrance is around back, son," the doorman said, not unkindly but with the authority of someone who'd had this conversation before. "I'm not looking for work," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother is sick, and I was hoping maybe there was some food left over, anything you might throw away anyway." The doorman's expression softened slightly, but his job was his job. "Sorry, kid. Can't help you there. Try the shelter on Calhoun Street. They serve dinner at 6. Tommy knew about the shelter. He'd been there before, standing in line with men who smelled like desperation and disappointment, waiting for a bowl of watery soup and a lecture about finding Jesus. But the shelter required an adult guardian, and he couldn't bring Sarah there. Not when she might start talking to invisible children or asking strangers if they'd seen her long-dead husband. Through the restaurant's windows, Tommy could see Marcus Whitfield at his usual corner table, the one the staff always kept reserved even when the restaurant was fully booked. Marcus was alone, as he always was, cutting his steak with surgical precision while he scrolled through his phone. Tommy had seen him before. Everyone in Charleston knew the Whitfield name, knew about the office buildings and shopping centers that bore his family's mark, knew about the money that opened every door in the city. What Tommy didn't know was that Marcus had also seen him, had been watching him, in fact, for the past 3 months. Had read the private investigators' reports about the boy who sang like an angel and lived like a ghost. the child whose very existence posed questions that Marcus wasn't ready to answer. When Tommy finally pushed through the heavy glass door, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the marble floor, Marcus set down his phone and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment, who'd orchestrated this collision between poverty and privilege for reasons that even he didn't fully understand. "Well, well," Marcus said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look what the storm washed in." The restaurant fell silent in that peculiar way that expensive places do when something unseemly threatens their carefully orchestrated atmosphere. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hovered over plates of $40 entrees, and the gentle clink of crystal stemware ceased as every eye turned toward the dripping boy who stood frozen just inside the entrance. Marcus Whitfield rose from his table with the fluid grace of a predator who'd been waiting patiently for prey to wander into his territory. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair swept back in a style that suggested both authority and cruelty, and his smile, that cold, calculating smile, promised that whatever came next would be memorable for all the wrong reasons. "Don't be shy, son," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the honeyed drawl that Charleston's elite used to disguise their venom. "You came all this way in the rain. Surely you have something to say to our fine gathering of citizens." Tommy's feet felt rooted to the marble floor, his thin shoulders hunched forward as if he could somehow make himself invisible. Water from his soaked jacket formed a small puddle around his worn sneakers, and he could feel the heat of dozens of stares burning against his skin like spotlight bulbs. This had been a mistake, a terrible, desperate mistake that he couldn't take back. "I'm sorry," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. "I'll go. I'm sorry." "Oh, but you've already interrupted our evening," Marcus continued, moving closer with each word. "The least you can do is make it worth our while. Tell me, boy, what brings you to the Magnolia on such a dreadful night? Surely not the ambiance." The other diners watched with the sick fascination of people witnessing a car accident, horrified but unable to look away. A woman in pearls clutched her husband's arm, while a table of businessmen leaned forward in their chairs like spectators at a gladiator match. This was entertainment now, a break from the monotony of their privileged lives. Tommy's throat felt like sandpaper, but desperation gave him just enough courage to speak. "My grandmother. She's sick, and we don't have money for her medicine. I thought maybe there was some food you might not need, something that would otherwise—" "Food?" Marcus interrupted, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "You want our food? Well, that's a reasonable request. But you see, nothing in this world comes free, boy. Even charity has its price." The trap was set, though Tommy couldn't see it yet. Marcus had been planning this moment for weeks, ever since his private investigator had confirmed what he'd suspected about the boy's identity. Tonight wasn't about coincidence. It was about revenge served at exactly the right temperature. "I tell you what," Marcus said, his voice now loud enough to reach every corner of the dining room. "I'm a fair man, and I believe in earning one's keep. You want food? Then entertain us. Sing for your supper, as they say. Give us a proper performance, and I'll see that you leave here with enough leftovers to feed your grandmother." The word grandmother dripped with skepticism, as if Tommy's entire story was nothing more than a practiced lie. Tommy felt his cheeks burn with shame, understanding now that he'd walked into something far worse than simple rejection. This man, this stranger in his expensive suit, wanted to humiliate him publicly, to turn his desperation into a spectacle for the amusement of people who'd never known a hungry day in their lives. I can't," Tommy stammered, backing toward the door. "Can't sing?" Marcus pressed, stepping closer. "But I've heard you can. outside St. Matthew's Church every Sunday, isn't that right? You have quite the voice, from what I'm told. Surely you can share that gift with us." The mention of the church made Tommy's blood run cold. This man had been watching him, studying him, waiting for this moment. But why? What could a poor boy from a trailer park possibly have done to earn the attention of Charleston's most powerful real estate mogul? "Come now," Marcus continued, gesturing to the captive audience. "These good people have paid handsomely for their dinner. The least you can do is provide some culture with their cuisine." Tommy's hands trembled at his sides. He thought of Sarah sitting in their dark trailer, talking to ghosts and forgetting to eat, of the empty medicine bottles and the past due notices, of the look in her eyes when she asked about Mama coming home. He thought of the $23 in their coffee can and the impossibility of making it stretch to cover everything they needed. "What do you want me to sing?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the restaurant's ambient noise. Marcus's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. "Oh, I think you know the perfect song for this occasion. Something about grace, perhaps. Something that speaks to the condition of souls in need of salvation." The reference to Amazing Grace wasn't accidental. Marcus had done his homework, had learned that this was Tommy's signature song outside the church, the one that made tourists reach for their wallets while their hearts swelled with carefully contained pity. Tommy closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the courage that had carried him through 8 years of loss and hardship. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of resigned dignity that comes from having nothing left to lose. "All right," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I'll sing." He didn't know that in the far corner of the restaurant, partially hidden behind a marble column, Eleanor Whitfield sat frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips, watching a scene she'd orchestrated in her nightmares for 30 years. She'd followed Tommy here tonight, had known Marcus would be at his usual table, had hoped somehow to prevent this collision of past and present. Instead, she was about to witness the moment when 3 decades of carefully buried secrets would begin clawing their way to the surface, one note at a time. Tommy Harrison stood in the center of the Magnolia Restaurant's dining room like a condemned man facing his final moment, the weight of 40 pairs of eyes pressing down on his thin shoulders. The silence stretched taut as a piano wire, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the tall windows and the barely audible hum of the air conditioning system that kept Charleston's elite comfortable in their ivory tower. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Marcus Whitfield's smile grew wider, feeding on the boy's visible terror. "Having second thoughts, son. It's quite all right. Not everyone is cut out for performance. Perhaps you'd prefer to earn your meal washing dishes in the kitchen instead." The suggestion drew a few chuckles from the audience, and Tommy felt his cheeks burn with shame. But then he thought of Sarah, probably sitting in their dark trailer at this very moment, asking the empty air if Tommy had remembered to practice his scales. Sarah, who had sacrificed her retirement savings to keep him fed and clothed, who had sung him to sleep with lullabies when nightmares about his missing mother left him sobbing in the middle of the night. Sarah, who had taught him that music wasn't just sound, it was the language the heart spoke when words weren't enough. Tommy closed his eyes and reached for that place inside himself where the music lived, the sacred space that poverty and hunger and fear could never touch. When he opened his mouth again, the first note of Amazing Grace poured out like liquid light, pure and crystalline and achingly beautiful. The transformation was instantaneous. The smirks faded from the diners' faces, replaced by expressions of wonder and something approaching reverence. Tommy's voice soared through the restaurant, filling every corner with a sound that seemed to come not from his throat, but from his very soul. He sang the way birds sing at dawn, not because they must, but because the music inside them demands to be free. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The words carried weight beyond their religious meaning, becoming a confession of brokenness and a declaration of hope all at once. Tommy sang with the voice of every abandoned child, every forgotten elder, every dreamer who'd been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. His voice cracked slightly on the word lost, and the vulnerability in that moment, the raw honesty of it, struck the listening crowd like lightning. At table 12, the woman who had dropped her wine glass earlier found tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached for her husband's hand, remembering suddenly their own son, who had died in infancy 20 years ago, whose voice they would never hear raised in song or laughter. The businessman at table 7 thought of his estranged daughter, who had begged him to attend her high school choir concert 5 years ago, a concert he'd missed for a meeting that couldn't wait, except that now he couldn't remember a single thing about that supposedly urgent business deal. Marcus's smile had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of growing unease. This wasn't going according to his plan. The boy was supposed to be humiliated, not transcendent, not filling the room with something that felt almost sacred, something that made Marcus remember why he'd once loved music before his mother's abandonment had poisoned that well forever. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. As Tommy reached the climax of the hymn, his voice rising to a note so pure and powerful that the crystal glasses on nearby tables seemed to resonate in harmony, Eleanor Whitfield felt 30 years of carefully constructed walls crumble around her heart. She had heard thousands of voices in her lifetime, had stood on stages with the world's greatest opera singers, had been applauded by kings and presidents and critics who wielded their pens like swords. But she had never heard anything like this boy's voice, never felt music reach inside her chest and squeeze her heart until she thought it might burst. This was what she had given up everything to find, and she had found it too late. The final note hung in the air like a prayer made audible, and for a moment, just a moment, the Magnolia restaurant became a cathedral, its wealthy patrons transformed into pilgrims who had stumbled accidentally upon the divine. Then the spell broke, and the applause began. Not the polite, measured clapping of social obligation, but thunderous, heartfelt appreciation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Tommy stood frozen, overwhelmed by the response. He had sung in church before, had heard amens and hallelujahs from congregations moved by his voice, but this was different. These people, these strangers who lived in a world so far removed from his own that they might as well have been inhabitants of another planet, were looking at him with something that approached awe. Marcus Whitfield found himself clapping along with the rest, his hands moving of their own accord while his mind reeled with confusion. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. The boy was supposed to be pitiful, pathetic, an object of scorn that would reinforce Marcus's worldview about the natural order of things, the deserving wealthy and the rightfully forgotten poor. Instead, Tommy had revealed something that Marcus had spent decades trying to deny. That worth had nothing to do with bank accounts or bloodlines, and everything to do with the immeasurable qualities that no amount of money could buy. As the applause finally died down, Eleanor rose from her corner table and began walking toward Tommy, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to destiny. She was elegant in the way that money and breeding could never fully achieve, her silver hair pulled back in a chignon that revealed the strong jaw and high cheekbones that Tommy would have recognized if he'd ever looked closely at his own reflection. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice cultured but warm, tinged with an accent that spoke of years spent in European concert halls. Truly extraordinary. What's your name, young man? Tommy, he managed, his voice still shaky from the adrenaline of performance. Tommy Harrison. Eleanor's face went pale at the surname, and she took an almost imperceptible step backward. Behind them, Marcus was watching the interaction with growing suspicion, his instincts warning him that this meeting was not the coincidence it appeared to be. Harrison, Eleanor repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the name on her tongue. And you live here in Charleston? Tommy nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance again now that the music had faded. The elegant woman before him was studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were searching for something specific in his features. With your parents? She asked gently. With my grandmother. My parents. Tommy's voice trailed off. He had never known how to finish that sentence, how to explain the woman who had left one morning when he was 3 and never returned, the father whose name Sarah refused to speak aloud. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she struggled to control. I see. And your grandmother, is she well? She has problems with her memory sometimes, Tommy admitted, loyalty warring with honesty. But she takes good care of me. She used to be a music teacher. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. A music teacher, memory problems. It couldn't be a coincidence. There were too many pieces fitting together too perfectly for this to be random chance. Marcus, who had been eavesdropping from his table, suddenly stood and strode over to join the conversation. His earlier humiliation had transformed into something darker, more dangerous. If this woman thought she could swoop in and steal his moment of triumph, she was gravely mistaken. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. How lovely to see you here tonight. I wasn't aware you'd developed an interest in street performers. Eleanor stiffened at the insult, but her attention remained focused on Tommy. Actually, Marcus, I think we should discuss providing this young man with proper musical training. A voice like his shouldn't be wasted. Oh, I agree entirely, Marcus replied, his smile returning. In fact, I was just about to offer young Tommy here a job. My landscaping crew is always looking for strong backs, and I'm sure the boy would prefer honest work to begging in restaurants. The deliberate cruelty of the suggestion made Tommy flinch, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped between them like a lioness protecting her cub. That won't be necessary, she said, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older breeding. Tommy, would you like to come home with me tonight? I have a guest room, and I'd very much like to meet your grandmother tomorrow. I think I might be able to help with her medical care. Tommy looked back and forth between the two adults, sensing the undercurrents of hostility that he couldn't fully understand. Marcus's offer felt like another trap, another opportunity for humiliation disguised as charity. But this woman, Eleanor, there was something about her that reminded him of Sarah in her clearer moments, a kindness that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Why? He asked, simply. Why would you want to help me? Eleanor's composure finally cracked, and a single tear traced its way down her cheek. Because, Tommy, she whispered, her voice breaking on his name, I think you might be the most important person I've ever met. Marcus watched the exchange with growing fury, recognizing that his carefully planned evening of entertainment was transforming into something else entirely. But he was Marcus Whitfield, heir to one of Charleston's oldest fortunes, and he had not built his empire by accepting defeat gracefully. How touching, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. But I'm afraid the boy already has obligations. You see, Tommy here and his grandmother, they owe me quite a bit of money. Don't you, son? Tommy stared at him in confusion. I don't understand. I've never seen you before tonight. Marcus's smile was poisonous. "Oh, but we've been acquainted for quite some time. You see, I own the trailer park where you live. And unless I'm mistaken, your rent is considerably overdue." The lie came so smoothly that even Tommy almost believed it, until he remembered that their rent checks were made out to Charleston Property Management, not to any individual. But the damage was done. Doubt had been planted, and several diners were nodding approvingly at Marcus's apparent generosity in not having the boy arrested for trespassing. Eleanor, however, had spent too many years navigating the treacherous waters of high society to be fooled by such an obvious manipulation. "How much?" she asked coolly. "Excuse me? How much does he owe you? I'll write you a check right now." Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this level of resistance, hadn't planned for someone else to call his bluff so directly. "It's not just about money, Mrs. Whitfield. It's about responsibility, about teaching young people that actions have consequences." "The only lesson being taught here tonight," Eleanor replied, her voice rising just enough to carry to the other tables, "is that some people mistake cruelty for strength. Tommy, gather your things. We're leaving." As she placed a protective arm around the boy's shoulders, Marcus felt something snap inside his chest. A cord that had been wound too tightly for too many years. This woman, this stranger, was taking away his prize, his moment of vindication. She was treating the boy with the tenderness that no one had ever shown Marcus himself, and the unfairness of it made him want to scream. "This isn't over," he said quietly, the words meant for Eleanor's ears alone. She met his gaze steadily, and for just a moment Marcus saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or guilt, or some combination of emotions too complex to name. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't suppose it is." Eleanor's penthouse apartment occupied the entire 32nd floor of Charleston's most exclusive residential tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the harbor, where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys in a bathtub. Tommy stood in the marble-floored foyer, dripping rainwater onto Persian rugs that probably cost more than his trailer, and tried not to touch anything that looked breakable, which was nearly everything. "Don't worry about the wet clothes," Eleanor said, noticing his discomfort. "Maria will take care of the rugs in the morning. Are you hungry? Of course you are. Silly question. Let me see what we have in the kitchen." Tommy followed her through rooms that seemed designed to showcase wealth rather than provide comfort. A living room with furniture that looked like museum pieces, a dining room dominated by a table that could seat 20, walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to disapprove of his presence. But it was the music room that stopped him in his tracks. A concert grand piano sat in the center of the space like a sleeping giant, its ebony surface reflecting the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Sheet music was scattered across its bench, complex pieces with names Tommy couldn't pronounce, filled with notes that seemed to dance across the pages like musical hieroglyphs. Along the walls stood instruments he'd only seen in books, violins in glass cases, a golden harp that looked like something angels might play, and a cello that seemed to glow with inner warmth. "Do you play?" Eleanor asked, watching his reaction with careful attention. "A little piano," Tommy admitted. "Sarah taught me some basics when I was younger, before her memory started getting fuzzy. Nothing like this, though. This is like a whole orchestra in one room." Eleanor moved to the piano and ran her fingers along its keys, producing a cascade of notes that seemed to fill the space with liquid light. "Music was my life for many years," she said softly. "I performed in concert halls across Europe, sang with the world's greatest orchestras. But I gave it all up when I moved back to Charleston 15 years ago." "Why?" Tommy asked, then immediately felt presumptuous for prying into this stranger's personal history. Eleanor's fingers stilled on the keys. because I had debts to pay that couldn't be settled with money. Sometimes the most important performances are the ones no one else ever hears. She played a few bars of Amazing Grace, the same hymn Tommy had sung at the restaurant, but transformed into something hauntingly beautiful through her interpretation. The melody wove through variations that spoke of loss and redemption, of mistakes that couldn't be undone, and forgiveness that might still be possible. "Your grandmother," Eleanor said, not looking at Tommy as she played. "Sarah Mitchell. She taught at Charleston Elementary, didn't she?" Tommy nodded, surprised. "You knew her?" "I knew of her. She had quite a reputation as a music teacher, very dedicated to her students. Some of Charleston's finest musicians got their start in her classroom." Eleanor's voice carried a weight that suggested personal knowledge rather than mere hearsay. "Tell me about her condition. When did you first notice the memory problems?" "About 2 years ago," Tommy said, settling into a chair that probably cost more than his family's annual income. "At first it was just little things, forgetting where she put her keys, asking me the same question twice. But lately it's getting worse. Sometimes she doesn't remember what year it is, or she talks to people who aren't there. The doctor at the free clinic said it might be dementia, but we can't afford the tests to know for sure." Eleanor's playing grew softer, more melancholic. "And your parents? What happened to them?" Tommy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came with this question. "My mom left when I was 3. Just disappeared one day. Sarah says she was sick, that she couldn't take care of me anymore, but she never talks about the details. And my dad—" Tommy shrugged, trying to appear casual about a wound that had never healed. "Sarah says it's better if I don't know about him, that some stories are too complicated for children to understand." The piano fell silent. Eleanor sat motionless for a long moment, her hands resting on the keys as if drawing strength from the instrument. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Tommy, how old are you exactly?" 11. I'll be 12 in March." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "March what?" "The 15th. Why?" She turned to face him then, and Tommy was startled to see tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's your middle name, Tommy?" "David." "Tommy, David Harrison. But I don't understand why." Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, muffling a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. 12 years ago, in March, she had made the hardest decision of her life, harder even than leaving her newborn son with his father 34 years earlier. She had walked away from someone who needed her, someone whose very existence was a reminder of mistakes that had cascaded through decades like dominoes falling in slow motion. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Tommy stood up, alarmed by her obvious distress. "Are you okay? Did I say something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Eleanor managed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You didn't say anything wrong. I think I knew your mother a long time ago, before you were born." Tommy's heart began to race. In 11 years of asking questions, no one had ever claimed to know anything about his mother beyond vague references to her illness and inability to care for him. "You knew her? What was she like? Where did she go?" Eleanor stood and walked to one of the tall windows overlooking the harbor, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. How could she tell this boy that his mother had been a gentle, troubled woman named Rebecca Harrison, who had worked as a house cleaner for some of Charleston's wealthiest families? How could she explain that Rebecca had fallen in love with a married man, had carried his child in secret, had disappeared not because she couldn't care for Tommy, but because she couldn't bear the shame of what their relationship had cost? "She was kind," Eleanor said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Very kind, and she had a beautiful voice, not trained like yours, but pure and sweet. She loved music, loved singing while she worked, and she loved you more than anything in the world, Tommy. Whatever happened, whatever choices she made, You must never doubt that. Then why did she leave? The question came out strangled, years of suppressed hurt finally finding voice. If she loved me so much, why didn't she try harder to stay? Eleanor turned back to face him, and Tommy saw something in her expression that he'd never seen in an adult's eyes when they talked about his mother. Guilt. Not pity or discomfort, or the carefully neutral sympathy that social workers and teachers had shown him over the years, but genuine soul-deep guilt. Sometimes, Eleanor said slowly, people make choices that they think are best for the children they love, even when those choices break their own hearts. Sometimes they believe that walking away is the kindest thing they can do, even when it's the hardest thing they'll ever do. Tommy stared at her, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn in his mind. You didn't just know my mother, did you? You were involved somehow in what happened to her. Eleanor's composure cracked completely. Tommy, there are things about your family, about your history, that are more complicated than you know. More complicated than I knew when I first saw you tonight. But I swear to you I never wanted you to suffer. I never wanted any of this. Before Tommy could ask what she meant, the intercom system crackled to life with the voice of the building's night security guard. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a Mr. Marcus Whitfield here asking to see you. He says it's urgent family business. Eleanor and Tommy looked at each other across the music room, both understanding that the evening's revelations were far from over. Marcus had followed them here, had somehow convinced building security to let him up, and his presence could only mean that the dangerous game begun at the restaurant was entering its next phase. Send him up, James, Eleanor said into the intercom, her voice steadying with resolve. But call my attorney as well. Have him come immediately. She turned to Tommy, her expression fierce with protective determination. Whatever happens next, whatever you hear or see, I want you to remember that you are not responsible for the choices adults made before you were born. Some secrets have been buried too long, and it's time for the truth, all of it, to come to light. Tommy nodded, though he didn't fully understand what she meant. All he knew was that this elegant woman who had rescued him from humiliation at the restaurant was now preparing to fight some kind of battle on his behalf, and that the war she was preparing for had something to do with his missing mother and the father whose name Sarah refused to speak. The elevator chimed softly in the distance, signaling Marcus's arrival, and Tommy felt the last pieces of his carefully constructed understanding of his own life beginning to crumble around him. Tonight had started with a desperate search for food for Sarah's medicine, but it was ending with revelations that would reshape everything he thought he knew about who he was and where he came from. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture that felt oddly familiar, as if she'd comforted him this way before in some half-remembered dream. Are you ready, Tommy? He looked up into her tear-stained face and saw something there that he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Recognition. Not just acknowledgement of his existence, but recognition of his worth, his potential, his right to belong somewhere in this vast and often cruel world. I'm ready, he said, and meant it. The sound of footsteps approached Eleanor's front door, and with them came the promise of answers that would either heal old wounds or tear them open beyond any hope of repair. Marcus Whitfield entered Eleanor's penthouse like a conquering general surveying captured territory, his eyes taking inventory of every expensive detail with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent his life calculating the worth of everything around him. His earlier humiliation at the restaurant had transformed into something harder and more dangerous. The cold fury of a man who had been denied what he believed was rightfully his. Quite the rescue operation, Mother, he said, the word mother falling from his lips like a curse. Though I have to say, your timing has always been impeccable when it comes to dramatic entrances. Tommy's head snapped up at the word mother. his confused gaze darting between Marcus and Eleanor as the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place with an almost audible sound. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a battle she'd been avoiding for 34 years. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this isn't about us. This is about Tommy and what's best for him." "Oh, but it is about us," Marcus replied, moving closer to where Tommy stood frozen beside the piano. "You see, young Tommy here doesn't know the whole story yet, does he? Doesn't know that his guardian angel has quite a history of abandoning children when they become inconvenient." Eleanor stepped protectively in front of Tommy, but Marcus's words had already found their target. "That's not fair, and you know it." "Fair?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the elegant room. "You want to talk about fair? Let's discuss how fair it was to leave a 5-year-old boy with his father while you ran off to chase your dreams in Europe. Let's talk about how fair it was to miss birthdays and Christmases and every milestone that mattered because the opera houses of Milan were more important than your own son." Tommy watched the exchange with growing horror, understanding now why Eleanor had looked at him with such desperate recognition, why her kindness had felt so urgent and guilt-laden. She wasn't just a wealthy stranger moved by his plight. She was trying to redeem herself for abandoning another child decades earlier. "I was 22 years old," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I was barely more than a child myself, and I thought—" "You thought you could have it all," Marcus interrupted. "The career, the acclaim, the freedom. And when reality didn't match your fantasy, when being a mother turned out to be harder than hitting high C, you made your choice. You chose yourself." "I chose what I thought was best for you," Eleanor protested, but even she seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded. "Your father could provide for you in ways I couldn't. He had stability, resources. He had money," Marcus said flatly. "But he didn't have love, did he? He didn't have patience or kindness or any of the things a child actually needs. He had expectations and disappointment and a talent for making me feel like I was never quite good enough to fill the space you left behind." Tommy felt something twist in his chest as he listened to this painful revelation. The elegant woman who had rescued him from humiliation was herself the source of someone else's deepest wounds. The irony was cruel. Eleanor was trying to save him to make up for failing to save her own son. "Marcus," Eleanor tried again, "I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes that can't be undone. But Tommy is innocent in all of this. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of our history. Doesn't he?" Marcus turned his attention back to Tommy, his eyes glittering with malice. "Tell me, boy, do you know who your father is?" Tommy shook his head, fear making it difficult to speak. Something in Marcus's tone promised that whatever revelation was coming would be devastating. "Your father," Marcus continued, savoring each word, "is David Whitfield, my father, which makes us brothers, Tommy, half-brothers to be precise. Both of us bastard sons in our own way, both of us abandoned by the people who were supposed to love us most." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. His legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair, his mind reeling with the implications. Marcus Whitfield, the cruel man who had humiliated him at the restaurant, who seemed to take pleasure in his suffering, was his brother. The father, whose name Sarah had refused to speak, was the same man who had raised Marcus to be cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. "That's impossible," Tommy whispered, but even as he said it, he could see the resemblance now. The same green eyes, the same stubborn jawline, even the same way they both tilted their heads when they were thinking. "Oh, it's quite possible," Marcus said. "In fact, it's the only thing that makes sense. You see, our father has always had a weakness for damaged women. Your mother was his housekeeper, sweet, simple Rebecca Harrison, who cleaned our house and sang while she worked. He seduced her, got her pregnant, and then sent her away when the scandal threatened to embarrass the family name." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "David told me she'd moved away for a job opportunity. He never said—" "He never said a lot of things," Marcus replied coldly. "Just like you never said you were coming back to Charleston to play fairy godmother to your lover's bastard son." "David and I—" Eleanor began, then stopped, realizing that denying the relationship would only make things worse. The truth was complicated, messy, and far more painful than any simple lie could be. Tommy looked up at her with eyes that seemed decades older than his 11 years. "You had an affair with my father," he said. Not a question, but a statement of terrible understanding. "That's how you knew my mother. That's why you felt guilty." Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It was after your mother had already left, Tommy. David was lonely, and I was trying to fill a void that nothing could fill. We found comfort in each other, but we both knew it couldn't last. When I left Charleston again, I thought it was over. I had no idea you existed until tonight." "But I did," Marcus said. "I've known about you for months, Tommy." "Had you watched, researched, studied like a specimen in a laboratory? Do you know why?" Tommy shook his head, beyond words now. "Because our dear father is dying," Marcus continued, his voice matter-of-fact despite the bombshell he was dropping. "Cancer, advanced stage. He has maybe 6 months left, and he's been racked with guilt about the son he abandoned. He hired private investigators to find you, wanted to make amends before he died. But I couldn't let that happen, could I? I couldn't let him give his fortune to a street rat while I've spent my entire life trying to earn his approval." Eleanor stared at Marcus in horror. "You've been manipulating everything. The restaurant, the confrontation, even Tommy's desperation tonight." "I may have encouraged certain circumstances," Marcus admitted with a cold smile. "Did you really think it was coincidence that the trailer park where Tommy lives raised their rent by $300 last month? Or that Sarah's medication suddenly became unavailable at the free clinic? I've been pulling strings for months, creating just enough pressure to ensure that our dear brother would eventually be desperate enough to do something foolish." Tommy felt sick, understanding now that his suffering hadn't been random bad luck, but deliberate cruelty. His grandmother's confusion, their mounting debts, even his hunger tonight, all of it had been orchestrated by the man who shared his blood but possessed none of his humanity. "You're a monster," Eleanor breathed. "I'm a realist," Marcus corrected. "I understand that sentiment is a luxury that only the secure can afford. You taught me that lesson 34 years ago when you walked out of my life. I'm simply passing it on to my newly discovered brother." The apartment's intercom crackled again, interrupting the tense confrontation. "Mrs. Whitfield, your attorney has arrived, along with the gentleman who says he's David Whitfield." "Should I send them up?" Eleanor's face went white. David was here, probably summoned by whatever emergency signal Marcus had triggered when he'd forced his way past building security. The final player in their twisted family drama was about to join the confrontation, and Tommy realized that whatever revelations had already shattered his understanding of his life were only the beginning. "Send them up, James," Eleanor said wearily. "I think it's time for all the secrets to come out." Marcus's smile widened. "Yes," he agreed. "It's time for everyone to see what happens when the past finally catches up with the present. This should be quite the reunion." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that seemed to echo through Eleanor's penthouse like a death knell. David Whitfield stepped into the foyer, and Tommy felt his world tilt on its axis as he came face to face with the man whose absence had shaped his entire life. At 56, David carried himself with the practiced dignity of Charleston's old money elite, but there was something fragile about him now, a gray pallor to his skin and a careful way of moving that spoke of illness held barely in check. Behind David came a younger man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase, Eleanor's attorney, no doubt summoned to deal with whatever legal complications this family reunion might produce. But Tommy barely registered the lawyer's presence. His entire focus was fixed on the man who had given him life and then pretended he didn't exist. "Eleanor," David said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years and regret. "When Marcus called and said there was a family emergency, I never imagined." His words died as his gaze found Tommy standing beside the piano, and the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. The boy had grown taller since the last photograph his private investigator had provided, but the green eyes were unmistakable. David's own eyes, staring back at him with a mixture of fear and desperate longing. "Hello, son," David whispered, the words barely audible in the sudden silence. Tommy's throat constricted. For 8 years he had dreamed of this moment, of meeting the father who existed only in Sarah's careful silences and his own desperate imagination. But now that it was happening, he found himself frozen between the urge to run toward this stranger who shared his blood and the impulse to flee from yet another adult who might disappoint him. "Don't!" Marcus said sharply, stepping between his father and Tommy. "Don't you dare call him son. You lost that right when you sent his mother away and pretended he didn't exist." David's face crumpled with pain that went deeper than physical illness. "Marcus, you don't understand. I wanted to—" "You wanted to what?" Marcus's voice rose with decades of accumulated bitterness. "Claim him? Love him? Give him the same cold, distant parenting you gave me? Or did you plan to abandon him the way you've abandoned everyone who's ever needed you?" Eleanor moved closer to Tommy, her protective instincts overriding her own emotional turmoil. "David, perhaps this isn't the right time or place." "There is no right time," David interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I'm dying, Eleanor. 6 months, maybe less. If I don't say what needs to be said now, I'll never have another chance." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Tommy felt something shift inside his chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition of shared mortality that transcended their complicated relationship. "You're sick?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the vast room. David nodded, moving carefully to sit on the edge of Eleanor's antique sofa. "Pancreatic cancer. Advanced stage. The doctors say, well, they say I should use whatever time I have left to make peace with my mistakes." "Your mistakes," Marcus repeated with bitter laughter. "Is that what we are? Your children? Just mistakes to be catalogued and filed away?" "You're not mistakes," David said firmly, looking at both his sons, the one he'd raised and failed, and the one he'd abandoned and lost. "You're the most important things I've ever done with my life, and I've failed you both in ways that keep me awake at night." Tommy found his voice at last, though it shook with emotion. "Why did you send my mother away? What did she do wrong?" David's composure cracked, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "She did nothing wrong. She was pure kindness, Tommy. She sang while she worked, always had a smile for everyone, treated me like a human being instead of just another employer. When your mother left, Marcus's mother, I was drowning in loneliness and self-pity. Rebecca was the only light in our house." Eleanor winced at the reference to her abandonment, but she remained silent, knowing that this conversation was long overdue. "I fell in love with her," David continued, his eyes fixed on Tommy as if memorizing every detail of his face. "Not the selfish kind of love that takes what it wants and discards the rest, but real love, the kind that wants to build a future together. When she told me she was pregnant with you, God help me, I was happy, terrified, but happy. Then why?" Tommy's voice broke on the question. If you loved her, if you wanted me, why did you let her go? David buried his face in his hands, and when he looked up again, his cheeks were wet with tears. Because I was a coward. My position in society, my business relationships, the family name, I told myself those things mattered more than love. I convinced myself that Rebecca would be better off somewhere else, that you would be better off without the scandal and whispers that would follow you if people knew you were my son. Marcus made a sound of disgust. So you bought her off, paid her to disappear and keep your secret safe. I gave her money, yes, David admitted. Enough to start over somewhere new, to raise you without the burden of our family's reputation. But she wouldn't take it, not for herself. She said if I wanted to help, I should set up a trust for your education, your future. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, you'd be taken care of. Tommy's world shifted again as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah's not really my grandmother, is she? David shook his head. Sarah Mitchell was your mother's friend, the only person Rebecca trusted with the truth. When her depression got too severe for her to care for you properly, Sarah agreed to take you in. I've been sending money through an anonymous foundation ever since, enough to cover your basic needs, though I see now it wasn't nearly enough. The medication, Tommy said suddenly. Sarah's pills. They've gotten so expensive lately. And our rent went up, and the trailer park said they might have to evict us if we couldn't pay. Marcus's smile was sharp and predatory. Amazing how financial problems seem to multiply when someone wants to create desperation, isn't it? Did you enjoy watching him suffer, Father? Did it satisfy some part of you to know he was struggling while you lived in comfort? David's face went white with understanding and rage. Marcus, tell me you didn't. Tell me you haven't been manipulating his situation. Oh, but I have, Marcus replied with evident satisfaction. Every unpaid bill, every denied medication refill, every little crisis that drove him closer to breaking point, all carefully orchestrated to ensure that when he finally reached rock bottom, it would be spectacular enough to satisfy my need for justice. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. Justice? You call torturing a child justice? He's your brother, Marcus. Your own blood. He's proof of our father's faithlessness, Marcus shot back. Just like I'm proof of your selfishness. We're both casualties of adults who put their own desires ahead of their children's needs. Tommy had heard enough. The anger that had been building inside him throughout this painful revelation finally found its voice. Stop it, he said, his voice cutting through the adult's argument like a knife. Just stop talking about me like I'm not here. The room fell silent, all attention turning to the 11-year-old boy who had been the subject of so much manipulation and neglect. I get it, Tommy continued, his voice stronger now. You're all damaged. You've all hurt each other and made mistakes and carried around guilt and anger for years, but I'm not your chance to fix the past. I'm not your redemption or your revenge or your second chance to get parenting right. He looked at each adult in turn, Eleanor with her guilty desperation, David with his deathbed regrets, Marcus with his bitter hunger for retribution. Sarah raised me, Tommy said simply. She's sick now and she needs help, and I love her more than anyone in this room. You want to know what would actually help me? Stop fighting about who's to blame for what happened 12 years ago and figure out how to take care of the person who's been taking care of me. David nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're right. You're absolutely right. Whatever our history, whatever pain we've caused each other, Sarah Mitchell deserves better. She's been the parent you needed when none of us were brave enough to step up. She's been more than that, Eleanor added softly. She's been everything we should have been and weren't. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of his estranged family, seeing something in Tommy's quiet dignity that he'd been too bitter to recognize before. This boy, his half-brother, had been subjected to cruelty and manipulation not just from Marcus himself, but from all of them, in different ways. Yet instead of breaking under the weight of adult failures, Tommy had somehow maintained a clarity of purpose and generosity of spirit that shamed them all. "The medical bills," Marcus said quietly, his voice lacking its earlier venom. "Sarah's treatment, the medications, whatever she needs, I'll take care of it. All of it." Tommy studied his brother's face, searching for signs of another manipulation, another cruel game. But what he saw instead was exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of someone who had spent so long carrying anger that he'd forgotten how heavy it was. "Why?" Tommy asked. "What's changed?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, younger somehow, as if the admission had stripped away years of careful armor. "Because," he said simply, "I remember what it felt like to be 11 years old and desperate for someone to love me unconditionally. Sarah gave you that. The least I can do is make sure she's around to keep giving it." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he held it out to Tommy. "This is information about the trust I set up for you, your real father's attempt to provide for your future. There's enough money there for Sarah's medical care, for your education, for whatever you need to build the life you deserve." Tommy stared at the envelope but didn't take it. "I don't want your money. I want Sarah to be okay. And I want to understand why my mother left, and I want—" His voice broke slightly. "I want to know if she ever thought about me, if she missed me." Eleanor moved closer, her voice gentle with shared pain. "Oh, sweetheart, your mother thought about you every day. She called Sarah once a week just to hear about your progress, your singing, your growing up. She never stopped loving you, Tommy. She just loved you enough to stay away when she thought that was what was best for you." "Where is she now?" Tommy asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the past tense Eleanor had used. David's voice was barely a whisper. "She died 2 years ago, son. The depression, the guilt over leaving you, it never got better. She couldn't forgive herself for the choice she made, even though it was the right choice for you." Tommy felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but the last, fragile hope he'd been carrying that someday his mother might come back, might explain her disappearance in a way that made sense of his abandonment. Now he would never hear her voice again, never know the woman who had sung while she worked and loved him enough to let him go. The tears came then, finally and completely, as Tommy mourned not just his mother, but his own innocence, his faith in happy endings and simple explanations. Eleanor was beside him in an instant, her arms around him in an embrace that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his hair. "I'm so sorry for all of it, for the choices we made, for the pain we caused, for taking so long to find you." Marcus watched the embrace with something approaching wonder. When was the last time someone had comforted him like that? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to need comforting? "Tommy," Marcus said quietly, "I know I don't deserve it, but would you let me try to be the brother you should have had? Not to replace Sarah, not to fix my own childhood, but just because maybe we both deserve to have family that chooses to love us." Tommy looked up from Eleanor's shoulder, his tear-stained face serious as he considered the offer. Then, in a gesture that would haunt Marcus with its simple grace for the rest of his life, Tommy nodded. "We can try," he said simply. "But Sarah comes first. She's been my family when no one else was. If you want to be part of my life, You have to be part of hers, too. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of 30 years of family dysfunction, something like hope began to take root in the elegant penthouse high above Charleston's glittering harbor. 3 months after that night in Eleanor's penthouse, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Sarah Mitchell's new room at Charleston's most prestigious memory care facility, illuminating a space that bore no resemblance to the cramped trailer where she and Tommy had scraped by for so many years. The walls were painted in soft pastels, original watercolors hung in simple frames, and a baby grand piano sat in the corner. A gift from Eleanor that had brought tears to Sarah's eyes during one of her increasingly rare lucid moments. Tommy sat beside her bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry that Sarah had loved during her teaching years, though he wasn't sure anymore how much she understood. Her hands, once steady enough to guide children's fingers across piano keys, now trembled constantly, and her eyes held the distant look of someone navigating a world that existed only in fragments of memory. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep," Tommy read, his voice carrying the clear, trained quality that months of professional lessons with Eleanor's vocal coach had developed. "But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep." Sarah's fingers twitched against the pristine white blanket, and for a moment her eyes focused with startling clarity. "Tommy?" she whispered, her voice paper-thin but unmistakably present. "Is that you, honey?" "I'm here, Sarah," he said, taking her hand gently. These moments of recognition were becoming rarer, more precious, like finding perfect shells on an increasingly empty beach. "Did you practice your scales today?" she asked, the question emerging from some deep reserve of maternal concern that her deteriorating mind couldn't quite erase. "I did. Eleanor's been helping me with a new piece, Schubert's Ave Maria. She says you used to sing it in the church choir." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her weathered features into something almost girlish. "Oh yes, I remember. Such a beautiful song. Your voice. It's so much like hers, you know." "Like whose?" Tommy asked gently, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Your mother's?" Rebecca had the voice of an angel, but she was too sad to sing, too broken by... Sarah's expression clouded, the clarity fading like morning mist. Someone was always breaking things in that house, beautiful things. Important things. Before Tommy could ask what she meant, the door opened and Marcus entered, carrying a bouquet of white roses and wearing an expression that had grown softer over the past 3 months. The bitter, calculating man who had orchestrated Tommy's humiliation seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who was learning, slowly and painfully, how to be gentle. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Marcus said, approaching the bed with careful respect. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah looked at him with the polite confusion she showed most visitors now, but there was no fear in her expression. Whatever damage Marcus had done to their lives, Sarah's failing memory had become, in its way, a kind of mercy. "I brought you flowers," Marcus continued, settling into the chair on the opposite side of the bed from Tommy. "The nurses said you liked roses." "They're beautiful," Sarah said, though Tommy wasn't sure she was seeing the flowers or something else entirely. Rebecca always loved white roses, said they reminded her of wedding dresses and fresh starts. Marcus glanced at Tommy over Sarah's head, both of them now accustomed to these fragmentary glimpses into the past that Sarah's condition sometimes provided. Over the months, these scattered references had helped them piece together more of the story. Rebecca's dreams of marriage and normalcy, her guilt over the affair with David, her desperate hope that Tommy would have a better life than she could provide. The door opened again, and Eleanor entered with Dr. Patterson, the neurologist who had become Sarah's primary physician. Eleanor's face was carefully composed, but Tommy could read the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped her purse just a little too tightly. "Tommy, Marcus," Dr. Patterson said with professional kindness. "Could I speak with you both outside for a moment?" Tommy's stomach clenched. He'd been dreading this conversation for weeks, watching as Sarah's good days became fewer and farther between, as her periods of confusion stretched longer, and her moments of clarity grew brief as candle flames in the wind. They gathered in the hallway outside Sarah's room, the institutional quiet broken only by the soft sounds of the care facility. Distant conversations, the gentle ding of elevators, the whispered consultations of medical staff. "The progression has accelerated," Dr. Patterson said without preamble, his honesty tempered by genuine compassion. "The Alzheimer's has reached the point where Sarah's quality of life is significantly compromised. She's having difficulty swallowing, her mobility is almost completely gone, and the periods of agitation are becoming more frequent." Eleanor reached for Tommy's hand, offering what comfort she could. "How long?" Tommy asked, his voice steady though his heart was breaking. "Days. Maybe a week or two at most," Dr. Patterson replied gently. "She's comfortable, we're making sure of that, but her body is shutting down. This is the natural progression of the disease." Tommy nodded, having known this moment was coming, but somehow never feeling prepared for it. Sarah had been his anchor, his constant, the one person who had chosen to love him when everyone else had walked away. Now she was leaving too, not by choice, but by the cruel lottery of biology and time. "She won't be alone," Marcus said quietly. "I've arranged for private nurses around the clock. And Tommy, if you want to stay here, in her room, we can set up a cot." Tommy looked at his half-brother with gratitude that still surprised him. The transformation in Marcus hadn't been sudden or complete. There were still moments when his old bitterness surfaced, when the habits of cruelty reasserted themselves. But love, Tommy had learned, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up again and again, even when it was difficult. "Thank you," Tommy said simply. They returned to Sarah's room, where she was sleeping peacefully, her breathing shallow but steady. Tommy settled back into his chair and opened the poetry book again, reading not because she could understand, but because the rhythm of the words seemed to comfort her, to provide some anchor in the fog of her dissolving mind. Eleanor sat quietly in the corner, occasionally humming melodies that Sarah had taught generations of children, while Marcus stood by the window looking out at Charleston's harbor, where expensive yachts bobbed like toys, and the afternoon sun painted the water gold. As evening approached, Tommy felt a strange sense of completion settling over him. This wasn't the ending he would have chosen for Sarah, but it was an ending filled with love and dignity, surrounded by people who cared for her. In 3 months, his makeshift family had grown from one failing guardian to include a father learning to be brave, a mother figure discovering redemption, and a brother slowly excavating his buried humanity. Sarah stirred in her sleep, and Tommy leaned closer to hear her whispered words. "Such beautiful music. The angels are singing." Tommy smiled through his tears, understanding that whatever came next, Sarah would leave this world having given him the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that he was worthy of unconditional love and the strength to offer it to others in return. Sarah Mitchell passed away on a Tuesday morning in April, just as the dogwood trees outside her window burst into bloom like white confetti against the Charleston sky. Tommy was holding her hand when her breathing simply stopped, so gently that he almost didn't notice the transition from sleep to something deeper and more permanent. Eleanor sat on the other side of the bed, tears streaming down her face as she hummed the melody to "Amazing Grace" that had first brought them all together in that restaurant months ago. Marcus stood by the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass, watching the harbor where shrimp boats were heading out for their morning catch. He had never been present for a death before, had never understood how quietly a life could slip away after making such tremendous noise in the world. Sarah had been a teacher, a guardian, a woman who had shaped dozens of young minds over 4 decades, and now she was gone with less fanfare than a candle being blown out. "She's at peace," Eleanor whispered, smoothing Sarah's silver hair with maternal tenderness. "She held on just long enough to make sure you would be okay." Tommy nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The grief was overwhelming, but underneath it lay something unexpected: gratitude. Sarah had given him 11 years of unconditional love, had taught him that family wasn't about biology, but about choice, about showing up day after day with patience and kindness even when the world seemed determined to break your spirit. The funeral 3 days later was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where Tommy had sung for coins outside the gates for so many Sundays. Now he stood at the altar in a black suit that Eleanor had bought for him, preparing to sing for Sarah one last time. The church was packed: former students who had traveled from across the country, fellow teachers who remembered Sarah's dedication, neighbors from the trailer park who had known her quiet generosity. David Whitfield sat in the front pew, his cancer having robbed him of weight and color but not of dignity. Beside him sat Emma Chen, the 9-year-old girl who had become Tommy's unofficial sister, her small hand tucked into Eleanor's, as if she'd always belonged there. The Whitfield family, broken for so long by abandonment and resentment, had somehow managed to rebuild itself around the most unlikely foundation: a boy with an angel's voice and a heart big enough to forgive. Tommy walked to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces that represented Sarah's legacy. He thought about the first time he'd sung in public, terrified and desperate outside this same church, and how different everything looked from this side of grief and grace. "Sarah used to tell me that music was the language God spoke when words weren't enough," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "She said that every song tells a story, and that the most important stories were the ones about love winning over fear, about hope surviving in the darkest places." He paused, looking directly at Marcus, then at Eleanor, then at David. "Sarah taught me that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, one choice at a time. She chose to love me when my own parents couldn't, chose to see potential in a scared little boy when everyone else saw just another burden. She chose kindness over bitterness, hope over despair, love over everything else." Tommy's voice broke slightly on the last words, but he steadied himself and began to sing. Not Amazing Grace, which everyone expected, but Bridge Over Troubled Water, the song Eleanor had been teaching him, the one that spoke of being there for someone when they needed you most. His voice filled the church with liquid gold, touching every heart present with the kind of beauty that makes people believe in something larger than themselves. As the last note faded into silence, Tommy saw something remarkable happen. Marcus was crying. Not the bitter tears of self-pity that had marked his life for so long, but the cleansing tears of someone finally letting go of old wounds. Eleanor reached across the pew to take his hand, and for the first time in 34 years, mother and son comforted each other without reservation or condition. After the service, as the mourners filed out into the warm April afternoon, David approached Tommy with careful steps. The older man looked fragile, translucent almost, but his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there months earlier. "Son," he said, and the word carried none of the hesitation it had held during their first meeting. "I want you to know that watching you honor Sarah today, seeing the man you're becoming despite everything, it's the proudest moment of my life." Tommy studied his father's face, seeing past the illness to the regret and love underneath. "She saved me, you know, Sarah. When everyone else walked away, she stayed." "I know," David whispered. and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of the son she raised." 6 months later, David Whitfield passed away in his sleep at the family mansion on Laguerre Street, with Tommy and Marcus at his bedside. His will revealed the final surprise in a story full of unexpected turns. He had left everything to Tommy, with Marcus named as trustee until Tommy turned 18. But more importantly, he had established the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Music Education, ensuring that her legacy of nurturing young voices would continue for generations. Marcus, rather than feeling betrayed by his father's decision, felt relief. The burden of living up to the Whitfield name, of maintaining an empire built on his ancestors' achievements, had never fit him comfortably. Now he was free to discover who he might become when he stopped trying to be who he thought he should be. Tommy used the inheritance to establish a music school in Charleston's most underserved neighborhoods, places where children like him might discover their voices despite their circumstances. Eleanor became the school's director, pouring her decades of musical expertise and her guilt-driven energy into creating opportunities for young people who had been written off by society. On opening day, as Tommy cut the ribbon in front of the Sarah Mitchell Academy of Music, he thought about the night that had changed everything. The desperate boy who had walked into an expensive restaurant looking for scraps and had found instead a family he never knew he needed. The building behind him buzzed with the sound of young voices learning scales and arpeggios, discovering that music could be a bridge between the world they knew and the world they dreamed of inhabiting. Marcus appeared at his elbow, no longer the bitter, calculating man who had orchestrated that first cruel encounter, but someone learning daily how to be gentle with both others and himself. "She would have loved this," Marcus said, gesturing toward the children streaming through the doors with instrument cases and eager faces. Tommy smiled, hearing in the distance the faint echo of Sarah's voice, reminding them both that the most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique, but from hearts willing to remain open despite every reason to close them. "Yes," he agreed, "she would have loved it all." Message for American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes the most profound moments of joy come disguised as heartbreak. Tommy's story reminds us that love isn't about perfect families or pristine circumstances. It's about showing up when someone needs you most, just as Sarah did for an abandoned little boy. In our golden years, we often carry regrets about the children we couldn't save, the chances we missed to be better parents or grandparents. But Eleanor's redemption shows us it's never too late to choose love over guilt, to build bridges instead of walls. Marcus discovered that healing begins when we stop nursing old wounds and start nurturing new growth. For those of us who've watched our own parents fade into memory's fog, Sarah's dignity and decline offers comfort. Love transcends even the cruelest diseases. Tommy's voice became the thread that wove a broken family back together, proving that sometimes the most wounded among us carry the greatest capacity for healing others. Every ending can be a beginning when we choose compassion over bitterness, hope over despair. Discussion questions. What moment in your own life taught you that family is about choice, not just blood? How has music or art helped heal relationships in your experience? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.